Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for joining me for this afternoon, Friends of the IRR briefing, the launch briefing of a very short, compact campaign from the IRR side to promote our forthcoming policy publication called Land, Lives and Liberty, a 5-point plan to save rural South Africa. Now, before I introduce our guest, I think I need to run through these 5 points to make clear why our guest is our guest indeed today, and that it forms an integral part of this plan. The 5 points are, firstly, making sure that the citizen can protect themselves, that they can take the necessary precautions in terms of safety and security in their own hands where the state might alternatively have failed. Secondly, from a governmental perspective, what can government actually do to make rural South Africa safer? Thirdly, property rights, a good old staple of all classical liberals and I think right-minded South Africans who understand that if you're going to have an economy, you need something to trade. The trade is the heart of any economic activity, and if you can't trade anything, you can't have economic activity, and if you can't own anything, you can't trade. So that third point of property rights really forms a fundamental part of this 5-point plan, and the last two, infrastructure development, investment, and job creation. And we'll get to the other 3 points later in the week. We have this briefing tomorrow and the day after. But today, I want to focus on safety and security. And to that end, we are joined today by Gideon Joubert. Now, Gideon, to those of you who might not be aware of him, you should follow him on social media. Gideon is the owner and editor, I think, of you are owner and editor, right?
That's it. Absolutely correct.
Owner and editor of Paratus. And he is such a relief of a voice on social media, especially to people like myself, when it comes to a controversial topic like gun rights, because Gideon is a gun rights activist, and he has recently launched, I think, a very effective policy proposal that we will dive into today. So I won't give away too much. I want people to keep watching. But Gideon has quickly established himself, in my judgment and that of my colleagues, as someone to really listen to on this. He understands the insides and the outsides. He has very, very interesting things to say. And we might even end up shamelessly borrowing some of his best ideas and try to promote that even further. So Gideon, thank you so much for joining us. It really, it's really a pleasure.
Thank you for the invite, Hermann, and it's an absolute honor to be here, and I will try to live up to the incredibly flattering description you've just painted of me. I don't know how accurate that is, but thank you. I do appreciate it, and one heck of a discussion to have.
Yeah, I definitely think so. I mean, on whether my description of you is accurate, don't worry, I studied law. And I'm slightly in politics. Why would I tell an untruth? No, I'm kidding. So let's immediately get down to it. You are speaking to, I don't think it would be offensive to anyone to say, a shocking layperson here when it comes to actual firearms. I've done my research as far as I can on trends, on gun violence. But when it actually comes to the nitty-gritty details, the responsibilities, the training of owning a gun, I'm a blank slate. So I might ask you incredibly stupid questions today, but I think that would help at least demystify some of the misconceptions. So when we think about personal safety, security of the person, of your loved ones, of property, why go to gun rights? Isn't that, a bit of a radical, extreme point to go, surely?
It may seem that way. So I'll start off with a mantra that I've very regularly sort of broadcast on all my platforms, and it's, you are always the first responder to your personal crime scene. Nobody is coming to save you. Prepare yourself accordingly. And that's not that's not a hyperbolic or over-dramatized statement. Quite literally, regardless of how effective your police force is, even in a country with an incredibly effective one, there's literally no other person that's going to be on the scene of the crime pertaining to yourself apart from you and the criminal and or criminals. So for you to make the best of that horrible situation and to survive and or triumph, you kind of need to be adequately equipped and prepared for it. The gun forms a single part of a much larger equation. Another thing I keep saying is mindset leads, training feeds, and equipment follows as the third most important thing. And that is kind of where guns come in the sense that there is a lot of, I'm not going to say hysteria in the media about it. I think we've become, the most recent discussions about the topic have become a lot more sensible than where they were 10, 15 years ago. But ultimately, the gun is just a tool. On its own, it's not some sort of magic talisman that's going to ward off evil by itself, by its mere possession. You have to use it like you'd have to use any other defensive tool, whether we're talking about pepper spray or whether we're talking about some sort of less lethal impact device or whatever it may be. And I've seen cases where people with the correct defensive mindset and a gun have triumphed over odds that they would otherwise not have been able to survive. However, the training part is usually important, the bit in the middle, because not only does that enhance mindset and skills and attitude and make you more effective with the equipment you have, it definitely enhances, or rather it improves your chances of fully handling the situation much better. But even in spite of that, even where training has been lacking, and I do not for a moment recommend not training, but a gun has proven to be such a great equalizer in modern times between people who are meek or weak or old or frail and a younger, more powerful assailant that we can't ignore the important role that they play in an overall defensive toolkit at all. And in fact, it's something that we have to talk about.
And I think part of what we have to talk about is, I mean, we can jump from the very day-to-day considerations of guns, but and self-defense. But in preparation for today's interview, I spent some time last night legitimately thinking, what are my options in a situation of compromised personal safety? I couldn't come up with a better. I mean, I've got burglar bars, I've got an alarm system, I've got a panic button. I mean, I'm the deputy head of policy research for a think tank. I'm not going to take someone in a fight. In a debate, I might, but I mean, when you talk about the meek, you talk about people who like myself might be not necessarily bulking Game of Thrones character to ward off an aggressive assault. And I really sat for about 45 minutes to try and think, if not a gun, what? A panic button, good and well, that's very important. Burglar bars, nice. I mean, you have to take necessary precautions. But as someone who has fired a gun once, and that was at a clay pigeon, and it was far wide of the shot, I mean, by mere logic consideration, I ended up thinking, my goodness, if you're going to take self-defense seriously, you have to take your tools seriously, and the effectiveness of a gun, I think, scares people. And what would you say on that score, that we have a culture that, I mean, guns, if you see a gun, I feel uncomfortable. What do you make of that fear?
I think, and to a large degree, I think that we have a very unhealthy gun culture in South Africa, in the sense that we associate the tool with criminal violence or with state-sanctioned violence to our history, which it has very much played a role in that. So a huge amount of stigma that has come attached to it in a country like South Africa. Now, if you look at other nations like Switzerland, Norway, Sweden, Finland, Iceland, and even to a very large degree, United Kingdom, They have far healthier firearm cultures than we do because they actually encourage openly that people who are interested in it must participate. They must learn to be safe, responsible, and law-abiding. And there are a great many resources in these nations. I'm leaving the United States out as an out because they have a humongous gun culture. I mean, I don't even need to say anything about that. Even the Canadians have a very solidly well-developed gun culture. And when we talk about gun culture, we talk about ordinary people having access to resources that encourage safe, responsible, and lawful ownership and use of these tools. And I think a huge degree of the effectiveness of firearms, because not almost all that we hear about them, but the parts that we fixate on when it does make the national news is when really bad, evil, and violent people use these tools in order to perpetrate sometimes quite terrible crimes. And that scares us, where we don't look at it through the other side of the lens and go, but by the same token, this is also a device of empowerment that can empower me as an individual who might not be remotely interested in learning how to cage fight or become a mixed martial artist or a samurai or the modern equivalent of that. It allows me, with a minimum of training and proficiency, to actually very effectively protect myself and the people I care about when and if, like, one or multiple bad people come to do horrible things to me. And that's a positive message, but we don't always get to hear it.
I think that the moment you assume that life or property is worth protecting, your own or someone else's, then you have to ask, is violence legitimate in protecting such things? And the moment you reach that point, as I think most people would, to believe that violence is legitimate or could be a legitimate deterrent to force in saving a life, saving, let's go to a worst case scenario, preventing a sexual assault. I mean, the moment you assume that violence has a legitimate form to counter violence, the moment you think a counterpunch is worth throwing, then it becomes a question of right. Now that we've established that punching back is legitimate, now the question is, how well and effectively can you throw a punch? So, speaking about gun culture in the UK and across the world, take us on an overview. What are some countries doing right, and what are we doing wrong? Because, as you say, we have an unhealthy gun culture. How do we learn from countries perhaps like Canada, like the UK, to understand that it's a force multiplier? I think is the word you use. It's something that could play a positive role if you assume that there's something like legitimate self-defense violence.
I think the first place to start with this is to start having honest conversations in a very public platform and say, okay, let's not pussyfoot around the issue. Let's not beat around the bush. Let's be straight and direct and speak honestly and through conviction about what firearms are and what they represent. To a large degree, I don't see myself very much as a firearm rights activist because as much as I like guns and owning them and shooting them at targets, I'm far more in love with what they represent. And they represent my individual freedom against criminal predation and freedom against state predation to a degree, because I am equipped to, ward those things off should they come for me. And if you look at South Africa's rate of gun ownership is pathetically low. I think our rate is at about 8 guns per 100 people, whereas a country like Canada is in the mid-20s or even, upper 30s. A great number of highly developed economies sit with much higher rates of civilian firearm ownership than we do. But you don't really read about these countries, and no one considers them, to use a very disparaging term, gun nut nations. But they have a much more prolific element of civilian firearm ownership, but murder is not a problem there. And I think it's a case of it's a society where personal boundaries are respected, or societies where personal boundaries are respected, where people's lives are respected and where there isn't a prevailing culture of violence, which is our primary problem in this country, not the weapons. And in order to develop, I think, a healthy gun culture, we have to start with a much deeper level of introspection and say we as South Africans should value our own lives and the value of the lives of our fellow citizens to a higher level, as well as their freedom to even do things that we may disagree with. But as long as they don't do predatory things to others, we must accept that they also have rights, freedoms, and these sorts of things. And once we can start having these mature discussions, then gun rights will part and parcel become part of it, because we will have a higher level of understanding. And that's fortunately where the IRR is doing so much good work. So thank you, Hermann, for actually being a building block into a more reasonable society. If I can put it as bluntly as that.
We certainly try, and I part of why I look forward to today is I would never consider myself a gun nut, but I love what you say. You know, what it represents is something quite profound. And I think you can even go, if I'm going to be dusty and boring and philosophical, you can go back to Locke and see in those writings that the ability to yourself as a citizen put a check on government power, not to be antagonistic towards it, but to acknowledge its existence, but also acknowledge the ability of it to overstep its mandate, then you have the American Revolution. You have the ability to bear arms and to say to a tyrannical state, no. Now, I don't for a moment say that we are threatened on the verge of a tyrannical state. I think some people in this country suffer very heavily beneath the boot of the government. I happen not to, in the broadest sense. I'm privileged in that regard, and I think many poor South Africans, ironically, sadly, tragically, black South Africans, really do get the heel of the state in a tyrannical fashion on their lives. But to me, something that stood out in my research was that one of the earliest incidents or manifestations of gun control was in the American South, where slaves were forbidden to carry arms because, quite obviously, that empowered them against people that didn't want to be empowered against.
Well, that's it. And in fact, South Africa has a similar sort of story. So back in the early to mid 19th century, a lot of black laborers in the colonies, and we're referring here to the Natal colony and the Cape colony specifically, were not remunerated for their work with money per se. A lot of them were paid in the form of rifles and ammunition, which were extremely useful tools to have back in the day. They had multiple uses. They're also a symbol of status and wealth. And the black laborers and the tribes that were paid in this fashion saw these rifles as incredibly important to them. So after a while that this has been going on, you sit with several quite well-armed and proficient black tribes, and a lot of the settlers and colonists got a bit nervous about this. So we saw a series of gun control legislation being passed. I think the most sweeping one was the Peace Preservation Act of 1878, if I recall correctly. And this led to two bits of bloodshed. The first one was in 1873 when the Amaglubi tribe in Natal, I can't remember who the governor was there at the time, demanded that they surrender their rifles. And Chief Langalebashele refused, and that led to a shooting conflict where he was unfortunately captured and banished to Robben Island. And Sir Reginald Oliver Pierce referred to this entire thing as a disgrace to British justice. And then a couple of years later, in the Cape Colony with the Peace Preservation Act, that led directly to the War of the Gun with the Basotho in 1880 and 1881, which the Basotho then won. And it was such a short but fierce conflict, and it nearly bankrupted the Cape Colony, and it resulted in the governor being replaced and the government being replaced. And not a lot of South Africans understand this, that we had fought wars in this country for the right to keep and bear arms, and these wars were fought by black tribes against colonial overreach, but these aren't well publicized stories, and very few people seem to know about them. So every time I tell it, I get a good response of people going, well, we never knew about that. And it's like, well, there it is.
So I think we've established quite firmly that the gun issue isn't for cowboys. It's much richer, much more complex than merely psychopaths who like killing things, like to kill things quicker.
Indeed.
I didn't grow up with that kind of idea, but I definitely have seen it on social media and so on. Is the moment you make a noise thinking that, guns might be, or the ability to arm yourself and to defend yourself is, it might be psychopathic. And I think that we've debunked that. I think historically, philosophically, there's sound reason for that. Now, nitty-gritty details. What's going on with firearms in South Africa? What's the situation? I know it's difficult for gun owners. Why is that? And how did we reach this point? And perhaps later we can discuss it. How do we get past it?
Well, what we have at the moment is the Firearms Control Act of 2000, which in some ways was a slight improvement on the previous act, and in many ways made everything a lot worse. It brought in a mandatory renewal period of either 5 years, every 5 years if you have self-defense firearms, or every 10 years if they're for sport shooting or hunting. Every individual firearm needed its own individual license. And the process is very arbitrarily handled by the South African Police Service and the Central Firearms Registry, to the extent where a person could be refused a license for a firearm that they actually have a very legitimate need for. And this refusal is based on the opinion of a police official. And you can now try and overturn this at the appeals board. The appeals board themselves have proven to not be entirely impartial in how they make their own decisions. So it's caused a degree of crisis where administrative justice is denied to people that really shouldn't be in that situation. We also have an additional crisis of about 500,000 to possibly 1 million people sitting with expired firearm licenses, where in a reasonable world you'd say, okay, if you have an expired license, you pay a fine and you are punished for missing a deadline, and then it's processed and you carry on with life. According to the way our law is written, if your license expires, it terminates, which means that you are 1 second to midnight, you are in completely lawful possession of firearms and ammunition. A second later, you are in unlawful possession of the same property with a potential 15-year prison sentence attached to it. So that is, in an attempt to rectify that through litigation and other efforts, gun rights organizations haven't been successful, which is where the whole license a person initiative kind of broadly comes in, is to say, well, this is a fight that one has to win in the court of public opinion and then take it to parliament, as opposed to trying to go to the courts all the time, where success just hasn't been forthcoming. In spite of all these difficulties, though, in my subjective personal opinion, South Africans have suddenly, I think, awoken to the fact that they cannot outsource their personal safety, and to a very large degree have to take responsibility for it. And the number of first-time gun owners that have just gotten in contact and said, we'd like to start the process, or we have, has been astounding. I've never seen anything like this before.
I'm reminded of a quote by, I think it was John Knott, who was the Secretary of Defense for Margaret Thatcher just around the Falklands War, when there were questions about should they send a fleet towards the islands, and the quote, I think, is the threat of sending a fleet is inferior to the threat of not sending one. So the threat of doing something here is, I mean, it's very real. And in your research, you look at things like homicides, violent crime. Now, I'm going to throw one of the counter arguments at you, is that guns make these things worse, not better. How would why would that be an ineffective counter argument from my side?
Well, it would be ineffective because it fixates on the object and not on the behavior. And I think one thing that I have learned over looking at many examples, especially if you look at the top 10 most homicidal nations on earth, where South Africa clocks in about number 7, if you correct for all the outliers, not a single one of those countries have permissive gun control legislation. In fact, all of them have extremely restrictive that borders on de facto bans, if not in law as such. And most of them have gone on very active civilian disarmament campaigns over the last 2 to 3 decades. Well, Jamaica having done this in the 70s, and their homicide rate quadrupled within 5 years of instituting what amounted to a civilian gun ban. And the reason these things fail is because human behavior doesn't change because parliamentarians write laws. All that you see is you either see a form of weapon substitution if criminals struggle to get a hold of guns, which they don't. They, in every single country where guns are banned for civilians, criminals seem to have no shortage of these things. So all that we're doing or achieving with this type of restrictive attitude towards it is, firstly, you are making it impossible for civilians to defend themselves effectively. And secondly, is you are creating a culture where people don't understand firearms. They have an unhealthy relationship with them. And if they then are exposed to them, their chances of behaving in a responsible, rational, or safe manner is even further lowered, or that problem is then exacerbated. So you create a multi-pronged problem by trying to focus on firearms as a causal factor of violence, which I personally don't believe they are.
And what strikes me as absurd about this is, if you are going to give a tool which acknowledged is very dangerous, if you are going to accept the reality that it's going to end up in someone's hands, will you as a legislator try to make it as easy as possible for a responsible person to have control over that tool, or will you make it as difficult as possible for them? And ironically, as we saw, I think, with the cigarette ban, 93% of smokers kept on smoking despite this, full-scale ban being in place. So to my mind, the current legislation makes it more difficult for exactly the type of responsible individual, law-abiding individual, that you would want to be in control of something like a firearm, and creates this perverse incentive that, there's no lack of guns in the Cape Flats.
Not at all. And in fact, and this is a very sort of disgraceful thing to have to say, but a large part of the problem has been the fact that the state has been terrible custodians, not only of their own firearms, but also of the firearms that were handed to them for safekeeping with the purpose of destroying these guns. And that's a tap that I just don't realistically believe will ever be closed, not unless there is an extreme attitude change from all the way to the top levels of government, all the way down to the street level with police officers in uniform on the beat regarding these things. I mean, we've seen, I think, at least 2 or 3 police stations actively robbed of firearms in the past quarter. So that's a thing that is becoming a sort of a new normal. And something else that I think you know me as a bit of a Second Amendment type, AK-47s for everyone type person. However, that being said, I think if one can encourage people to be active participants and active members of a firearm owning community pertaining to equipping themselves with more knowledge, more skills, and refine their attitude towards safety and being responsible and law abiding, if you can create that culture, if you can feed that culture and make it flourish, then you will end up with a armed, trained, proficient, responsible, law-abiding citizenry, which is an absolute national security and public safety asset, much, I believe, to the same extent that herd immunity protects us from diseases, even if it's a minority of the citizenry that take it seriously enough to that level. Criminals don't know who are armed. the opportunity cost of violent crime increases as a result of it. It's not the golden magic bullet to solve the violent crime problem, but it's certainly, I think, an important factor in combating it.
In your research paper that you sent me a few weeks ago, you referred to General Stole's admission to Parliament. Now, that is such a potent thing that I actually want you to tell our listeners what did the general admit to Parliament in that context.
He said, our National Commissioner of Police said to Parliament that the South African Police Service is overstretched and that it is impossible, the word he used was impossible, to fulfill its constitutional mandate, which is damning, to say the least.
And it really is. I mean, it's damning is absolutely the correct word there. So, but let me throw. I've given you a softball question. Now allow me to give you perhaps one of the other volley questions that people who are opposed to gun rights often say, is that, in so many instances, your own firearm ends up being used against you. So having a firearm in your home, rather than being a tool for you to protect yourself, it's actually a tool for wrongdoers and rogues to actually exploit in the other direction.
So this is one of my favorite myths to bust, and we've done a lot of work on it, and Africa Check very nicely did a debunking on it as well. I think it was last year. Firstly, just a caveat. There are incidents where these things happen, where people leave their guns locked in the safe. Their passive barriers either don't exist, or their doors aren't locked, or their alarms aren't armed. People gain access to the house. They hold the occupants up. They gain access to the safe, and then they gain access to the person's firearm that's locked in the safe. And then it is used against them in that context. That is, however, very much a minority thing. So the origins of this is Gun Free South Africa put it as one of their top talking points, and I think they put it everywhere, just short of being on bumper stickers a couple of years ago. And investigating where it came from, they claimed it was from research by Anthony Altbecker, who wrote A Country at War with Itself, as well as a bunch of other books and research papers on violence. And we made contact directly with him and said, listen, would you mind pointing us, like, where in your research you came to this conclusion, because we can't find it? And he didn't want to get involved in a debate. And he said the reason you can't find it is because it doesn't exist. So he sent us his research with reference to certain paragraphs and pages. And in the study that this was supposedly originating from, his conclusion was that, or rather his words were that the conclusion of the study militates against drawing any inferences that your firearm is more likely to be used against, or the defender's firearm is more likely to be used against them. And in fact, the opposite conclusion, that the defender is far more likely to successfully use their gun in defense, holds far more true, or rather holds true according to his conclusion. And I just thought, okay, well, that's a pretty straightforward answer. And it does make sense if you think about it. If this was the case, police officers and security officials surely would not carry guns, because the liability of carrying them would then far exceed the benefits. Bear in mind, that being said, if you are a gun owner and you're watching this and you feel overly confident, please go practice good weapon retention techniques and go train that stuff, because it doesn't require rocket science, but it can make a difference. And that is really the solution to it if people bring it up. But yeah, it's a myth.
So I'm latching onto that word solution. Your proposal of license the person, register the firearm. Take us through that, because I find it an intriguingly practical approach that I think we already take in certain other areas of life where licensing is involved, perhaps vehicle licensing. But take us through that.
I'm glad you said vehicle licensing, because that's kind of how we would like to approach this. And bear in mind, this is a public participation campaign. It's democratic. My ideas are not God. I do not own this intellectual property. And in fact, I would encourage people to disagree with me where they deem it necessary and add further suggestions, because ultimately I want a plan that's acceptable to the broader public and that is sellable to Parliament with the pressure of the public behind it. So that's very important. The idea here is that present system means every single gun you own needs to have its own individual license. You are already considered a fit and proper person, but you would need to motivate a need that you have already proven for every individual firearm. And ultimately, you end up with a stack of paperwork about that big that a designated firearms officer at your local police station must process, amongst a whole bunch of other duties they have to do and other paperwork they have to process. We're sitting with a horrendously inefficient system that is just sapping police resources away from actual law enforcement in order to deal with this. And it costs upward of 124 million rand a year to administer this, increasing annually. What we propose is that you as the individual, whether you're a juristic person or a natural person, you become the licensed entity. Your firearms are then placed on an electronic register under your name, not unlike the UK shotgun certificate system, but quite a bit more enhanced and modernized on top of that. This database would refer e-connectivity exists between firearm dealers, the police, and the central registry, which does not need to be administered by the police. That can be given to an independent body that can do so with the required oversight, as well as due adherence to the protection of personal information, IT security, information security, all these other things. And this means that you can in real time track who owns what do they have under their name. It would make the process more speedy, more efficient. It would release police resources to the fact that they can now, or rather to the duties of enforcing this act, auditing the registry, make sure people with guns comply with the law, which is why I took an angle of saying that it will enhance public safety and security and enhance the rule of law in South Africa, or promote the rule of law, because I believe it will. The real-time tracking becomes important, not so much for ordinary citizens, but if you are a security company, and you, at the moment, what they do is they sign their firearms out to the armed guard on duty with a registry and a piece of paper. If you could do that electronically, it means that wherever this person interacts with law enforcement during the course of their day, or wherever it needs to be checked up on, you can see immediately on the system what should they have in their possession, what should the serial number be, and do they in fact have it. And if this gun should go missing, you could pretty much track it instantly. Well, not via GPS track it, but you could, the paper trail for tracking it immediately exists. So there's a lot of intricate stuff behind this. And even better, what do you think the cost of a system like this would be, Hermann?
Genuinely, when we're talking about police budgets, I mean, it depends on how much you build in for some, cadre lubrication of deals here. But I've no idea. I've read through your research, and I can't remember for the life of me.
I did not actually put the number in the research, but the most expensive quote I got from people who know what they're doing was 2 million rand.
So we've got 120 million rand on the current system, the paper-based system, in the hands of a police force that are about as effective at paperwork as they are at fighting crime, versus something that what's the opposition you've encountered to this? Because I really went into this conversation trying to think, right, I'm not going to give you an easy ride, but you've got good arguments. And I mean, when you're 2 million, 120, what's the opposition you've encountered that really pushed against this movement?
The one that I seem to get a lot, and one of the board members of Gun Free South Africa submitted their comments on the server, which I actually really appreciate. So Dr. Matsopoulos, if you happen to be watching this, thank you for your comments, sir. I do appreciate it, and it's a democratic process, and all voices matter. And his opposition and the handful of negative comments that we have gotten in total has been, but this will make it easier for people to gain access to guns. And my counter argument is not really, because the same vetting process that has always existed still exists. And in fact, we can enhance it to make it more effective, because we need to also accept that no system is perfect and undesirable people will slip through the cracks. I would prefer there are resources behind the net to catch the undesirables that slip through, as opposed to there being full trust in the system and there being no resources because they're all being squandered on this net. There's nobody behind the net to catch what gets through. If you're a fit and my counter question would be, but if you are a fit and proper person that fully satisfies the criteria of being a law-abiding, responsible, and competent individual, on what basis should you be denied a license? And that's something that a lot of people don't, the usual answer is, yeah, but then we have more people owning guns, so criminals can get their guns from civilians. I go, well, that's a different argument altogether, which I don't believe. But we have to, at some point, believe in some sort of civil rights and freedom as well.
Now, as we approach the end of our session, and I think it's been fascinating to me, is getting this idea from concept. Take it. How would it manifest in reality if we place ourselves in the position of many citizens in rural South Africa who are vulnerable by isolation geographically, vulnerable because their local police forces simply are not up to scratch, and according to General Sithole can't shoulder their constitutional mandate. If you get your way and this policy proposal becomes law, how does that affect the life of your South African male, female, somewhere in rural South Africa concerned about their safety?
I would say that from a personal level, for you as a citizen, we would take a process that is onerous, complicated, expensive, difficult, and with a massive waiting period attached to it. A waiting period that's not mandated by any law, but that's a direct result of how inefficient and archaic and Luddite-esque the present system is. And we can take a lot of that inefficiency and cut it out. And if you are a fit and proper individual who needs a firearm for self-defense because you are at risk, you are at least now guaranteed to firstly get that license, and secondly, get it in a much shorter period of time, a markedly shorter period of time than you would otherwise have to wait for it. So we actually are, I'm trying to enhance the empowerment of the individual's ability to look after themselves and their families. From a government point of view, and I'm speaking from an ideal world perspective, that the resources that are freed up with this can be redeployed to enforce the law, to redeploy manpower and other financial resources in such a manner that we can effectively combat crime or fight crime or put them in a position to catch criminals, to combat real crime, whatever we need to do. I'm jaded, perhaps, and maybe overly cynical here, because I don't believe that is quite how the police service works. I think when the budget gets freed up, it's not going to get redirected to a useful purpose, unfortunately. But I'd like to believe that that doesn't mean I'm going to argue that it shouldn't be. It should most definitely be, and I'm hoping that that's the case.
Gideon, I really want to thank you for this discussion. Our 45 minutes are within seconds of being up, but I found it incredibly educational, and as someone who came to this with little knowledge about how this would work and what the actual effect of it would be, I think you offered a lot of good ideas and a lot of food for thought for people to reconsider their idea of what gun rights actually are, to be willing to see self-defense as something that is worth it, that is legitimate. And those two things together with, I think, your very powerful point about cultural change, attitudinal change, not staring into an object, but into the broader idea that there's a responsible way to do this. I think that really has given me a lot to think about. And genuinely, I think your proposals have incredible merit. Now, before we leave, I should give you a last word on this. What's the one thing that people need to take away from our discussion today?
I think if there's one thing I'd like people to take away, it's that you cannot outsource your safety and the safety of your family to the government or its agents or organs. It's something that you, unfortunately, and this is the harsh reality, have to take direct responsibility and accountability for. And it's up to you to decide how you wish to equip yourself, and I'm referring to knowledge, skills, and tools in order to enhance your ability to respond to such events that may compromise that security. And it's, again, it's your choice and it's up to you.
Well, I think that is, yeah, I think that is as sound as it is possible to be. Gideon, thank you so much for joining us in this live stream, in this webinar, the first of three on looking at deep dive issues of our 5-point plan. The first point being citizen safety, how to take control of that, and I always think that one of the reasons the Brexit campaign was so successful is it really sought to empower. Take back control was such an empowering message for the individual that I think what we at the IRR try to do, and what I think your proposal here does, and your advocacy and your activism, for which I think I respect you and thank you, is that it offers an opportunity to a country that has felt it has lost control over everything, to really take back control and understand that your liberty, your life, your property is worth fighting for. Gideon, thank you so much. Friends of the IRR, people who've joined us today, thank you for your support. This would not have been possible without your support, your monthly donations. We appreciate it immensely. Keep an eye on this week as we continue elaborating on this 5-point plan in Land, Lives and Liberty, a 5-point plan to save rural South Africa. We will be launching that document on Saturday alongside a mini documentary taking a closer look at life in rural South Africa. Now, when people say be safe in these times, they mean it in terms of illness. But I think with regards to South Africans and the challenges we face in terms of crime and what we might have learned today here, when I say be safe, I mean you have the ability to make yourself safer than the government has. And for that, you need to take back control. Thank you very much, everyone. Live free, and we'll see you again tomorrow.